Hey, what's going on everybody? Commander Crane here, and we're back with another Pioneer deck tech, and today we're going to be talking about Budget Gruul Kicker. I'm very excited to bring this very spicy list to you. As always, at the end of the video, let me know in the comment section below, what do you think about the deck? Is there something that I forgot to include in this deck, or do you have suggestions for upcoming videos? Just let me know in the comment section. So, okay, a little bit of backstory with this deck. So, as I typically do here on the channel, I always try to find, decks that are very unique or feature cards that typically don't see a lot of play in a particular format, whether or not it's just because there's not the right shell or, even if the card's not quite up to par in terms of the competitive metagame. I like featuring different cards. And I was trying to find, like some high synergy cards, basically just perusing through, Gatherer and things like that. And I happened to find a whole bunch of kicker cards, and it made me think, okay, how many kicker cards are actually in the Pioneer format, and is there enough to make a decent deck? And lo and behold, I found a lot of sweet kicker cards. There was a whole bunch I wanted to feature, but I think I found the right combination, I would say, of kicker cards. So let's go and hop into it here. So, okay. Kicker, for those who don't know, is obviously most of the time with Kicker, you're paying additional mana to be able to get an additional benefit from that specific card. So obviously, Land of Elves and Elvish Mystic are very, very important for that because they help, accelerate our mana. So that way we can actually pay the Kicker costs on a lot of our creature. We're also playing 4 Vine Gecko. This card is sweet. 2/2 for 2. The first kicked spell you cast each turn costs 1 less to cast. So it's basically a cost reducer. And then whenever you cast a kicked spell, put a +1/+1 counter on it, which is sweet, so it gets a little bit bigger as time goes on, and then it's also a cost reducer, so definitely a huge fan of Vine Gecko. So let's go and start looking at some of our kicker creatures that we're actually playing. So we are playing 4 Yavimaya Iconoclast, 4 Untamed Kavu, and 4 Gnarlid Colony. So Yavimaya Iconoclast is fantastic. It's essentially a 3-mana 4/3 with Trample and Haste, which is really, really good. Obviously, it loses the 1/1 because it's only till end of turn, but Yavimaya Iconoclast is really, really strong. Untamed Kavu, I love this card. A little bit of backstory with Untamed Kavu. It was actually my very first top 8 that I ever had. It was in Standard years ago when Dominaria was like the newest set in Standard, and I played this card, and it was sweet because you either played as a 2/2 for 2 with Vigilance and Trample, but if you kick it for 3 mana, it enters with 3 1/1 counters on it, and it's a 5/5 with Vigilance and Trample, which is pretty sweet. So definitely a huge fan of Untamed Kavu. Then we're also playing 4 Gnarlid Colony. In its own way, it is kind of like an Untamed Kavu, but what's sweet is each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it has Trample, so a lot of our creatures get 1/1 counters when they are kicked, and then obviously the Gnarlid Colony, if it's kicked, it gives itself Trample, which is pretty sweet. So definitely a huge fan of Gnarlid Colony as well. And then rounding out our creatures here, we're playing 4 Shatterskull Charger. I really like this card. It's just so fast. It's a 4/3 for 3 Trample and Haste. Obviously, if we kick it for kicker 2, it enters with a 1/1 counter on it. And then it also says at the beginning of your end step, if Shatterskull Charger doesn't have a 1/1 counter on it, return it to its owner's hand. So what's really sweet is if our opponent is playing, like, for instance, like Blue-White Control, and they're playing a bunch of Supreme Verdicts and Sorcery Speed removal, we don't have to kick it. We can just keep putting it into play, attack for 4, return it to our hand. So definitely a huge fan of Shatterskull Charger. We're also playing 4 copies of Halar the Fire Fletcher. I really like this card. 3/3 for 3 with Trample. Whenever you cast a spell, if that spell was kicked, put a +1/+1 counter on it, then Halar deals damage equal to the number of 1/1 counters on it to each opponent. So obviously we just get a bunch of free value by kicking all of our creatures. It gets Halar a little bit bigger. We deal some extra damage. Definitely a huge fan of Halar. I think it's one of the better cards in the entire deck. And then we're also playing 2 Inscription of Abundance. It's a kicker removal spell, which synergizes really, really well with the deck. Obviously, you choose one mode for 2, but then if you pay the kicker, you choose any number of them. Put 2 1/1 counters on target creature. Target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control, and target creature you control fights target creature you don't control. So definitely a huge fan of Inscription of Abundance. This card is sweet for this deck for sure. And then rounding out our deck here, we are playing 2 copies of the Akron War and 2 copies of Tyvar Stand. So Akron War is pretty self-explanatory. It's really good in these red-green aggro decks. We steal our opponent's best creature, we get a whole bunch of value from it. What's not to like about the Akron War? And Tyvar Stand is pretty self-explanatory. I wanted a protection spell in this deck just because of how the overall Pioneer metagame is. There's a lot of removal flowing around, so I wanted to play just some cheap removal or cheap protection, and Tyvar Stand is fantastic because it's kind of like a pump spell spell, but being able to give a creature hexproof and indestructible is really, really good. So definitely huge fan of the 2 copies of Tyvar Stand in the deck. So that's it for the non-land cards. Let's go and talk about our lands real quick, which we are a budget deck, so we have a pretty standard mana base. We're playing 4 copies of Copperline Gorge, 4 Rootbound Crag, and 4 Game Trail as our main dual lands for the deck. Obviously, Copperline is fantastic just because it's a really good dual land. It's one of the best ones in the format, and it's really budget-friendly. Rootbound Crag and Game Trail, not quite as good, but still solid in their own right. And then rounding out our lands, we are playing 5 mountains and 5 forests, and as our spicy basic lands of the day. So with kicker spells, whenever I think of kicker, I immediately think of Zendikar because of, like, you know, World Wake and such, having like multi-kicker and a whole bunch of different kicker cards. You know, I just think of Zendikar whenever I think of kicker, so I wanted to include some really cool Zendikar lands, and I decided to do the Zendikar Rising full art basics. So definitely a huge fan of both these artwork. I really like the Zendikar Rising full arts. Typically, you know, I'm more of like, oh, I like the old school ones better, but I really think that the Zendikar Rising extended art or the full art lands are sweet. So definitely a huge fan of those. So couple things we still have to go over. We still have to talk about our sideboard as well as some budget options, or sorry, upgrade options for a deck since we are a budget deck. So sideboarding is really, really simple. We're going to want some Graveyard Hate. Tormod's Crypt is the best option on a budget. You could also play Soul Guide Lantern, but I personally would recommend Tormod's Crypt. Extra removal. A lot of it comes down to what our metagame looks like. Is there a whole bunch of, you know, different like white decks floating around? Play Lithomantic Barrage or Rending Volley. Is there just a whole bunch of like Shieldrids and Vein Rippers floating around, which we'll talk about, I guess, Vein Ripper in a second. Play some Scorching Shots. It deals 5 damage to a creature for 2 mana, which is fantastic. You know, is there a whole bunch of small creature decks running around? Maybe play some Flame Sweeps or some Anger of the Gods. Really just depends on what your local metagame looks like. Vampire Hate. We're definitely going to want some Vampire Hate. Vampire is just everywhere in the format right now. I personally recommend pick your poison. I would play at least 3 to 4 copies of it, in addition to maybe a few Pithing Needles to name on Sorin as well. It's definitely very, very important to stop the Sorin Vein Ripper combo. You know, the mid-range package is very good, but we can slog through that. Just make sure, Vein Ripper, we don't let him get it down too early. It's very, very important. We're also going to want some anti-life gain just because of the Amalia combo decks and always those pesky angel decks that are floating around. At a budget level, I personally recommend Giant Cindermaw, but if you'd like to upgrade into Rampaging Ferocidon, that's also a very, very solid option. And then the last thing I want to talk about, the upgrade options, which obviously upgrade the dual lanes. You know, get yourself some Stomping Grounds, some, what are they called, Crag Crown Pathways, some Carplusion Forest. That's fantastic. But for the most part, that's it. We didn't have to cut any creatures due to budgetary restrictions. We still get to play all of the exact same creatures. The last thing I want to mention, though, at least in terms of upgrades, is there's definitely a lot of potential for a Teamer Kicker deck. There's a lot of good blue cards that have Kicker, or if you cast a Kick spell, you get a benefit. So definitely you could look into that if you're really looking to upgrade the deck. You know, play Teamer, get some, you know, Botanical Sanctums and such, maybe a couple Breeding Pools. You could definitely do a pretty sweet Teamer Kicker deck. The last thing I want to mention in terms of the budget is the budget list is only $40 US, which is extremely cheap for a budget deck. Most of the budget decks we do here on the channel are definitely not that cheap, which is sweet. And the upgraded list that I put in the description is only $199, which is really cheap. Pretty much the entire reason that's pricey is because of like Boseiju and Sekenzan and what is it, Stomping Ground. That's really the only reason the deck is even somewhat pricey. So if you're looking for a really fun Gruul aggro deck that, you know, you want to play at FNM, play against your friends or anything like that, or even just have an extra deck so that way you can loan it to one of your friends for FNM or playing at your house or whatever, I think that this is a fantastic option. There's so many unique cards in this deck that we really don't get to play in other decks. So I think that's really, really cool. You know, if you like Untamed Kavu like I do, or Halar, or other sweet kicker cards, I think this might be the perfect deck for you to build for Pioneer on a budget. So that takes us to the end of the video here. Thanks so much for watching. The deck lists are in the description below if you'd like to check them out for yourself. Huge shout out to our channel members, Ralph, Matt, Arcadius, Ray, Gary, and Seronoki. If you are interested in being a channel member, it's only $1 US a month. You get access to the exclusive Discord where if you want to talk more about kicker cards, feel free to join the Discord, and you also get other features here on the channel. So definitely consider being a channel member here. So I'm Commander Crane. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.